Welcome to Close Listening. I'm Zach Morgenstern, joined as always by silent co-host Ludwig von B. And today we are going to talk about The Who, specifically my experience listening to this album, Who's Next. I was very excited when I came across it by chance in a record store earlier this year. For years, all my exposure to The Who has been through this record in my collection, Meaty, Beady, Big, and Bouncy. This is Who Greatest Hits collection of their work through the 60s. The slightly odd title of it refers to nicknames for all four members of The Who. So Meaty was Roger Daltrey because he was muscly. Beady was Keith Moon because beating the drums. Big was John Entwistle because big guy. And Bouncy Pete Townsend because he liked to bounce around the stage. But anyway, for years, this 60s greatest hits collection of The Who was my one exposure to them. And then one day, someone played for me the song Baba O'Reilly and said it was a song by The Who. And that just didn't make any sense to me because Baba O'Reilly is a song that really takes its time to get started. It has a really intense vocal performance and it relies a lot on synthesizers. It does not sound at all like the music on here, which roughly sounds like early Beatles kind of stuff. Over the years, I occasionally heard other isolated tracks from the time of Who's Next or later. And another thing that really stood out to me about them was the vocal performance. When one listens to Roger Daltrey in the Who songs of the 1960s, he's certainly a good singer. He can carry the tune, he gets the job done, but you don't listen and think, wow, that band's singer is a standout. It seems like he has a good but average voice. Whereas suddenly you're listening to Baba O'Reilly and his voice is soaring and epic and growling, and you're like, where the heck did this version of Roger Daltrey come from? Was he like a great singer all along? Did he have some lessons in the late 60s that allowed him to take things to another level? I don't know. But that was what drew me to this album. And as I listened to it, as I looked a bit into its context, I was reminded of that series of videos, I believe from the YouTube channel Wisecrack, called Deep or Dumb. So every time I'm thinking about this album, I keep being tempted to call it Lifehouse because that is what it was almost called. Pete Townsend was working on a rock opera at the time that was going to be called The Lifehouse. And I see this image and I think, oh, I guess that big concrete block in this middle of nowhere kind of space is this mysterious Lifehouse. So I have to keep reminding myself that this album is called Who's Next? But to add to the Deep or Dumb, when I looked at this photo, even when I remembered the title, I can continue to say to myself, okay, well, at least they're going for a profound image. And then I read a description of it, and these black marks on here, which I had looking at the album not very closely, thought were maybe like shadows of the guys or just stains on this block. Apparently, you're supposed to look at that and see pee stains. And suddenly I looked closer at the guys and realized, oh, they're pulling their pants off as if they were just peeing on this block. So what is this? Is this some profound, epic step forward in the career? Or are you supposed to go, ha ha, the guys took a piss on their album cover? Well, I'm going to break this album down track by track, and you can decide Deep or Dumb. So it opens with the epic song of Baba O'Reilly. It certainly has an epic feel to it, though it relies on its sort of simple but always epic sounding chord pattern. This was made fun of in a Family Guy sketch where Peter Griffin does a karaoke performance of this song, and of course it takes forever to get started. I guess one thing I have to remind myself with this Baba O'Reilly song is, nowadays I can just go onto my home recording program and pull up a million synth sounds. Whereas back in the late 60s, I imagine it was more experimental to create these sounds. You had to actually fool around with the big synth machine, and it was genuinely exciting to produce these sounds on record. But it also just feels like it's part of the broader concept. It's talking about alienated people, the teenage wasteland. So one of the things I'm realizing about The Who now that I'm learning a bit about them is that the songwriting disproportionately was by Pete Townsend, their lead guitar player. I'd kind of assumed for years that it was sort of a similar setup to the Beatles with Lennon and McCartney, or the Stones with Jagger and Richards. I figured there were at least two guys collaborating on this work. But it seems really like the dynamic with The Who is that while Roger Daltrey had the charisma to be the front man, and generally the others in the group were, happy just to be a 60s rock band, Pete Townsend was like the ambitious man behind the screens. He wanted to be scenes. He wanted to be Bob Dylan or David Bowie. And in the case of this album, he was influenced by a spiritual figure. I don't know how to pronounce this, Meher Baba. And it's very hard for me to tell exactly what Meher Baba stood for, whether this is well represented by the sort of people who've written about it, because I feel like it's hard to tell whether Pete Townsend was fully in his right mind, because he can be a very lucid speaker when he wants to be. But it feels like the very simple idea of Meher Baba's spiritualism and the idea behind the Lighthouse album was that there was this profound state of spiritual ascending to heaven that can be achieved through the sort of communing of musician and audience. So the idea of starting your album out with a song about alienation, it's kind of like, come into this new religion. We have the new answer for you. Track two is called Bargain. This one starts out sounding more like a rocker, but pretty quickly one can hear Pete Townsend's rock opera ambition as kind of like a Broadway musical. It splits into different parts, with Pete Townsend singing vocals on some of them instead of Roger Daltrey. At first, it sounds like an arbitrarily intense love song, but then I looked into this theme, this whole Meher Baba spiritual thing, and I'm like, oh, this isn't about, a bargain romance. This is the bargain of making any sacrifice for eternal life with God. Then we get track three, which is called Love Ain't for Keeping. This one has more of a country feel to it, and I feel like Daltrey's vocals become a bit more humble here, and it's just a nice little hippie scene. Track number four is called My Wife. So this one is actually written by the bass player John Entwistle, and again, more familiar with The Who's 1960s greatest hits, I associated him with the novelty song Boris the Spider. I felt like that one worked for him. He's the bass player. That song is heavy on bass. It's kind of light. You remember it. Whereas My Wife, it's an attempt to just be a serious, catchy rock song. Uh, it it has some nice ambitions to it. It's about the idea of love being a wild ride, almost comparing being in love to his wife to being a spy adventure. Unfortunately, I just think the big rock sound of it all kind of overpowers Entwistle's voice, and I don't know if that's because John Entwistle wasn't really a singer or they just kind of botched the production on this one. Track number five is another song that shows Pete Townsend's compositional ambition. It opens with piano and a melancholy vocal performance from Townsend before the guitars come in and Daltrey gives another one of his over-the-top rock vocals. Overall, I found this one quite nice. All the different parts of it sounded quite good. The only thing is sometimes I feel like the ambition of the rock opera thing means the song itself doesn't become an earworm that stays in your head. Sometimes a simpler song is better if it gives it that continuity, that stick factor that allows you to remember it. Track six is called Getting in Tune. This song is about the tension between wanting music to be deep in some way and just liking playing for its own sake. A surface reading of the lyrics would say they don't have any deeper meaning, but obviously the fact that the singer is singing about this tension between meaning and no meaning is meaning in its own sake. Track number seven is called Going Mobile. It kind of sounds like a skateboardy song and also has this weirdly futuristic feel to it, even though it's just sort of like a hippie out on the road song. I think generally one of the things that stands out with this Who's Next album is that the Who overall, I guess because of this experimentation with synth, have a thicker sound. The 1960s stuff, I thought the lyrics were good, the music was catchy, but there was something underwhelming about the overall sound. Track number eight is called Behind Blue Eyes. So this was supposedly the theme for the villain in the Lighthouse album. And I guess it seems to be about the idea of evil being this force within you. One is not evil because one of any concrete actions one committed, but one is evil because one has this evil bubbling between the surface. And then finally, we get Won't Get Fooled Again. Given the opening line, it feels like it's possibly in dialogue with the Rolling Stones' Street Fighting Man, that being a song that sort of glorified the idea of going out in the streets and being a protester, whereas this song seems to be saying, all political movements are the same. They're all trying to trick you. The only valid one is this musical spiritual path that Pete Townsend is going on. Certainly a fine song, though I'm not sure I'm down with the message. Plenty of political movements to be cynical about, but I feel like just rejecting everything rather than getting into the specificity of what's right and wrong about everything is just sort of unhelpful and just ultimately props up the status quo. For this reason, I'm much better like the Beatles slash John Lennon song Revolution, because though he also provides his cynicism about left wing political movements in that song, at least he states out why. He's like, look, man, I sympathize with a lot of the goals of socialism, but I'm too much of a hippie to be a revolutionary. Whereas the sort of vagueness of Pete Townshend's Won't Get Fooled Again doesn't quite work out for me. So, who's next is a deep or dumb. Regardless, it's clearly an important historic record. It's great to hear the Who taking their sound to the next level, and great to hear, Pete Townshend's ambitions coming out not just in his lyrics as it had throughout the Who's career, but starting to come out in some of the musical choices. And for Ludwig von B and myself, I will see you next time.